It's like this, man. You're like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. Ain't nobody sees nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. So like it ain't gonna candle, man. It don't matter, man. These old
All right, Isaac Young, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Pretty good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, man, I'm glad to have you back on. I always enjoy repeat conversations because I feel like the first time you speak with someone, you're figuring them out, right? You're sort of building that rapport, and so I feel like the repeat occurrences are always a little bit smoother, a little bit better. And honestly, man, I'm excited to have you back on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I always find it's the first time around you're trying to figure out the other guy's tempo, especially in terms of how much is this more of a monologue situation or is it a more back and forth situation, which is
Oh yeah, 100%. Like it's very different. Like I mean, this is not a criticism at all, but I recently had Joel Evan on, and that was a podcast that was effectively short interjections into a monologue, and he's a very talented speaker, right? But that's a remarkably different interview to wrangle, right, than someone else where it's more of like sitting down having a conversation. So last time you were on, obviously we talked about the book that you had published. And you've been busy, right? You've been working on other projects. So I'm curious, you want to just describe what you've been working on briefly for my audience?
So I've transitioned from, for a variety of reasons, I've transitioned into making audio shows as my primary form of fiction output. And we can get into the reasons why behind that, I guess, later. I think there's strong reasons why Honestly, I think books are sort of on the way out due to not only the modern market, but also complications caused by AI and how they interface with especially the Amazon marketplace. I think that being an indie author is going to be somewhat of a struggle going forward. So I basically did some self-reflection and I'm like, all right, how can I adapt to the modern world as an artist? And what form should I be embracing as an artist? And I realized that I wanted to go with an audio show. So I started up a audio show based on one of my novels called The Last Human. And if I could make a pitch for that, it would essentially be a reactionary take on Star Trek, where the story is set essentially after the Federation's collapse. And it follows the survivors of humanity struggling to make their way in a decidedly post-human galaxy. And that would be, I'd say, the main thrust of the story.
So I want to take a step back. You mentioned the way in which Amazon in particular has been affected by AI. Do you want to provide more detail on that?
So right now, the main struggle is that the indie market on Amazon, where you just you self-publish a book, it was already incredibly saturated by the time ChatGPT and all these other AI tools came around. It was basically if you're starting up as an indie artist, you're essentially trying to grow an audience, which is really difficult with lots of competition. Basically, you're not only competing with other indie authors, you're competing with traditional publishers and essentially everyone else who is also on the marketplace, including all the dead people, all the dead authors. You're basically competing with every single author in history on that same marketplace for a share of that attention. And it's only become exponentially more difficult due to AI. Because what we're seeing now is we're seeing a lot of AI-generated books appear on these platforms. I was talking with a friend of mine recently where he recently read a full-length AI novel that had quite positive reviews on Amazon. And he was looking at this work and he's like, all right, now we have to compete with basically a machine mass producing indie books. And at that point, it's going to become essentially impossible to try and grow an audience because no one's going to be able to find you. You're never going to be able to stand out.
So I'm curious. I obviously have encountered short form AI writing, whether it's like a product description or just, something you see on Twitter, for example. But I mean, does it read like a real person wrote it? Like, is it advanced to that point?
Well, for myself, no, but I'm not the average reader, and a lot of average readers have been fooled by these new AI generated books, or at least if the reviews aren't an indication. They could also be botted, which is just another problem. Is how do you tell if a product is actually genuine quality assurance or not? Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Basically, there was I do remember there was another separate incident where a woman's romantasy novel, she used AI to generate it, right? And she left the ChatGPT prompts in the novel, and people were looking at these the prompts and asking, well, what is this? Why does it suddenly say ChatGPT, please make this scene more spicy? But they were clearly fooled up until that point.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, I don't want to engage in what the leftists would call punching down, but if there were a genre to literally crank out, by machine learning, that would be a pretty easy one to do, right? Yeah, it's an interesting point. This was several years ago, kind of before the mass adoption of these LLMs. But I was, helping some friends move, had some time in the car, and one of my friends had gotten into, one of these closed betas, right? Shortly after the very, very early kind of like mid-journey stuff, right? Where it still all kind of looked like horrifying and nightmarish. But, as a joke, we were like, oh, I bet we could write one of these like romantasy smut novels using AI. And look, I'm not going to pretend that it was good or that we were taking this particularly seriously. But I mean, even then, which would have been 3-4 years ago, it was readable, technically prose, right? And so you don't really have to be a genius to figure out how that tech advances. I also wonder if part of what we're seeing is the kind of death of like mass market fiction in that way, where it's kind of not necessarily literature per se, but just more of like the kind of like airport store books, right? Which are designed to sort of be disposable. And obviously, people have made money doing that. And I prefer a person to be doing it than, a machine. But as you've said before, these aren't exactly discerning readers. At a certain point, quantity has a quality all its own, and especially if the cost to actually produce one of these is effectively nothing. I mean, you can see why market incentive leads that way.
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy in that is I've actually, I've had good experiences at the airport, at least when I was younger, where I'd pick out a book and I'd genuinely have something, good in my hands. Nowadays, that's certainly not the case for any bookstore across the country. I mean, I tried to go to a bookstore with my brother not a few months ago, and it was awful. All the front store shelves were extremely left wing, to put it politely. To put it more accurately, there was a lot of LGBTQ stuff and romantasy, and a lot of other degenerate stuff that I wouldn't want to read in a million years. And the funny thing is, we were actually there for the manga section, which is sort of begrudgingly taken a hold in almost every bookstore in the country, because that's the stuff that actually sells. But it's not the stuff the bookstore wants to sell, so they kind of shove it near the back and let it grow as it slowly consumes it from the inside out. It slowly consumes the bookstore from the inside out. But yeah, the one interesting discourse that I kept my finger on that happened very recently, a month or two ago, was the slop culture discourse, and how everything is sort of descending towards this homogenous, mass-produced, very low effort type of culture that is basically just overwhelmed everything by its sheer quantity. whereas the quality has never been lower. And a good discussion out of that discourse is trying to how to fight back against this slop culture, and how do we create art that is, one, can compete on those grounds, and two, is actually financially viable, because that's the main constraint with right-wing art production. Is it's not financially viable for most people to do. It's a hobby. It's basically an artisan niche. And that's kind of what's the current state of it, with a few exceptions, with a few publishers trying to breach more into the mainstream.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, right? That, fundamentally you are dealing with, a niche audience, right? And there are pros and cons to that. Because it's niche, you have an opportunity for personal expansion, right? If you have interesting things to say, they're much more likely to be seen. But it's a small pie, right? The reason that you're not competing with, Simon and Schuster effectively is, well, I mean, honestly, there's some ideological reasons as well, but it's too small for them to notice, really, compared to the, the kind of massive, market segments for, Tom Clancy-esque novels, or, romantasy, the other kind of stuff we talked about. I don't know if I share your kind of opinions about books writ large. Dave has been talking about this, but I have as well with my kind of close friends and family, that effectively we live in a no more literate society than at almost any other time in history. We have a great number of people who technically know how to read, but very few that actually read anything worth knowing.
Yeah, that was the death blow that I was going to mention later. Is that on top of competing with all those other things I said, you're competing with video games and YouTube, which is infinitely worse.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that. So you mentioned that you moved to audio for kind of market reasons, and so what is the process, right? Obviously, writing a book, you were sitting there typing all day, but is this still something that you are writing like a book and then narrating and turning into sort of an audio drama-esque situation? Like what is the difference there?
So yeah, right now I'm sort of, I guess, more in the audiobook side of things, where I use minimal sound effects and just one narrator. I'm hoping to eventually, like, just by ramping up in terms of let's say just finances, I'll be able to expand and do much more complex productions. But right now I'm essentially just getting started and transitioning my stuff over. Because I basically took one look at how things were online, and I thought to myself, okay, if it's extremely difficult to get people to read prose, and I have to compete with YouTube videos, I might as well just make my work at the other end of that click, at least for a few people. And that was sort of my head calculus there. And what I'm hoping to do is build enough of an audience through Patreon, where for $3 a month you can access. There'll be a number of episodes that are free for the public, and they'll be released weekly. But with Patreon, you can pay like a $3 subscription to get access to the full show as it is, or $5 or $10, whatever, and then build a financial. Just build my finances from there, so I can ramp up production.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that's another thing that makes right-wing creation difficult is our opponents have a whole patronage network, right? So even if the book is, or whatever the product is not a financial success, there's a thumb on the scale, right? One of the kind of interesting things that came out of the whole USAID debacle is that Doge was going through and basically tabulating how much certain media outlets were paid by the government, either directly or indirectly, right? Okay, sure, we gave you a check that said $5 million on it, but on the other end, right, if every single government office is, maybe not required, but does have a subscription to your magazine, well, that's basically a government subsidy, right? And that's kind of silly example, right? Obviously, that's news writing; it's more political, but you see the same thing in the arts as well, right? You look at all of these different grants for the arts, all of these different fellowships that exist, and they're producing, shall we say, distinctly ideological content, right? There's a great sculptor, follow on Twitter, Willie something, I can't remember his full name, but he's a fine art sculptor, and that's one of the things that he talks about, right? Is the degree to which there's this whole system of kind of grants and funding that is opaque to someone wanting to start out. That it's effectively a whole patronage network that most people don't see, but exists to kind of push art in one direction or another.
And the problem is that even if you're aware of it, if you belong to an untouchable caste in this country, aka white straight men, you're essentially excluded from it. And I know there's been a bunch of huge scandals recently with traditional publishers where basically big names have come out and said, yeah, don't bother if you're a white straight man, because there's no shot that you're going to get a publishing deal at all. And we've known this has been going on for decades. I mean, it's basically every single mainstream industry in this country is built around these sorts of DEI discriminatory policies. And they're certainly, I mean, all these patronage networks exist for the left's client classes. And if you're not part of that, well, tough luck.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously the sort of market forces we mentioned earlier, I think are, part of the reason that the arts writ large have deteriorated. But I mean, another one is that, and to say that, art is ever a meritocracy is, not necessarily a claim I want to argue, but as it's gotten further and further away from that, right, where you effectively rewarded for ideological loyalty instead of anything else. Well, again, right, it's no shock that the output has suffered. That system has moved from one thing to another. That is no longer culture bearing. It exists as another kind of apparatus of the party. There's this great section in Moldbug, right? I think it's in either UR or Open Letter to an Open-Minded Progressive, where he talks about the concept of the German cat, right? And he's going through this I think it's like a journal for cat breeders, right, in Nazi Germany. And the whole point is like it's a completely unimportant thing. But he talks about how, in the 1920s, it is a journal that exists purely to write about cats, right? There's nothing more to it. That is the purpose of it. But by the end of the war, right, as the Reds are kind of closing in on Berlin, they're writing about the concept of a German cat, right? The idea is that thing has become politicized. And look, his point there was not necessarily a historic one, assigning blame or praise to any regime, but to say, right, like, look, like in a system where everything is political, it finds its way even into technically non-political things, which I think is always kind of a funny thing when we talk about art, because the quote unquote right-wing cultural commentators who talk about media, whether it's video games or film or books, they're always, whining on and on and on about how they want to keep politics out of their media. And I get it, right? They're saying something that is directionally true, right? I want this left-wing nonsense out of my life. But I think that they're very naive, the degree to which that is simply human nature. And the problem is not necessarily that there is politics per se in the arts. It's just that the politics of our regime are really horrible and produce, one, bad art, and two, block creative, interesting people from being able to kind of come up to the table. You see what I'm saying, Isaac?
Yeah, I definitely do. And actually, I run into this quite a lot on Twitter when I talk about left-wing versus right-wing art, because it's interesting for me as someone who's Gen Z, and I discuss this with older people when I say there is a need for right-wing art, because they have an older definition that I don't think is quite in use with my generation. Because for them, left-wing versus right-wing are just political parties where they're like two separate, but fundamentally good. Well, I wouldn't say good, but they're valid directions for the country. They're a set of policies. Whereas for my generation and the people I talk to, left wing versus right wing aren't necessarily politics, but just spiritual modes of where the left wing is the establishment, yes, but they're also basically the embodiment of just corruption on every single level, from political corruption, religious corruption, to even the corruption of the body and the policies they support, or just the ideas that they support. Whereas right wing is a lot more fluid. It's not something that is rigid. It's not necessarily a political party, but it's something that's in opposition to the spiritual decay of the left wing.
Yeah, I think that sort of is speaking from a time, right? When, the difference between right wing and left wing was, a certain amount of social signaling, and then also, your opinion on economics. There's an interesting infographic. I can't remember what outlet initially posted it, right? That was basically tracking ideological diversity on the left and right. And it's, as you can imagine, a very tight bubble on the left and a very wide, kind of spider web on the right. And, I think it really comes down to, entropy, chaos, evil, whatever you want to call it, all pulls in one direction. There is one way to do that. Whereas, when we're looking at order, there are quite a lot of different ways to organize that order. I have pretty fundamental disagreements with, some chapters of the right wing writ large, but nonetheless, I think that's why that the right is largely heterodox, because the unifying factor is a rejection of that entropy. And again, right, that's a very different way of looking things than John McCain versus Joe Biden, for example, right? The kind of two sides of the uniparty. And similarly, I think that there's another problem that right wing art or conservative art is seen to be as something that's kind of speaking to kind of day-to-day current politics, right? So for example, like, oh, well, right wing art would be something like what the Daily Wire did, where they do a movie with Gina Carano. Is that the woman I'm thinking of?
Yes.
The WWE actress who got canceled. And okay, well, yes, it is by the barest definition art, right? But really it is making a commentary on, we have our own celebrity, or we can do our own thing. And they're kind of aping the political forms of Hollywood, or not the political, the kind of visual forms. So both in what they're producing, but also, right, they do this kind of like weird, awkward knockoff red carpet event. They rented like a Holiday Inn, and they're doing the thing, right? And they're like, oh, guys, we did it. We did what cool, successful liberals do.
Yeah, they want to be the elite human capital of liberals in the 90s.
Right. And again, that by that definition, it's like, well, right wing art is horrible. But if we look at right wing as simply like having a concept of human order, right, or being anti-entropy, it's like, well, effectively everything good has that in it. And look, like I like Hemingway as much as the next guy, and he was kind of a gay communist. But the idea that all art is either conservative slop or inherently left wing, it's just a complete and total fallacy, right? It is, you are so locked into that dyad that you can't make interesting claims about the world.
I mean, I would argue that all the slop that people associate with the right wing is actually entirely left wing. I mean, you look at the Mr. Burkham show, right? Who do they star as their protagonist? An out of touch dad who is basically grumbling at the world. He's very impotent. That's a left wing. That is the left wing frame that has basically gripped this entire culture since The Simpsons. That's not a right wing idea. That's a left wing idea, and that's the left wing frame is the impotent father who is unable to process the times that he is living in.
Well, I think that it's really a deeper problem, that they cannot comprehend a moral landscape where the left isn't winning. They're completely and totally owned, and the best they can hope for is to be the the grumpy dad who's actually right. And again, right, it comes down to, your inability to make an alternate moral claim about the universe, right? If the whole kind of locus of your your being, your movement, your tendency, whatever you want to call it, is effectively to stand astride the train of progress and yell stop, it's like, well, that's not a way to organize a society. You've admitted that you act entirely as the brakes on a trajectory that you arguably agree with, if not by stated, then at least by revealed preference. And again, right, it's no shock that these people who don't even have enough of a moral backbone to kind of offer their own political view don't have enough of a moral backbone to write or say anything worth listening to. It's completely and totally like infertile. It reminds me very much of the prescriptions in Dante against kind of like usury or sodomy, right, where they're just kind of hoeing the empty ground at forever in hell. That is what conservative media is. It might be a bit dramatic, my opinions on it, but I'm willing to fight for it.
Yeah, it's because, I mean, unfortunately, part of the reason why the left is so like they can't make any good entertainment anymore is because like none of their politics, none of their spirituality reflects real spirituality or the real, true, the good, and the beautiful. They're entirely fake and gay, as everyone's clearly seen by now. And if you try to break out of that frame, you start saying some very dangerous things for the left's worldview, and those things can easily get you canceled. Those things can easily, make you a pariah. And things are certainly better nowadays, now that the right is at least reaching a I don't want to call it a new political paradigm, but the right certainly has enjoyed a great more deal of freedom in the Overton window than we have in living memory. But yeah, it's very dangerous to create right wing art, and that's part of why it's not really created by these institutions.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? That one of the things that I find very frustrating about artists, as someone who's spent a decent amount of time around art school kids, right, is presenting themselves as social rebels, right? Of adopting the kind of like modes and motifs of left-wing radicalism. And look, I get it that can make you feel cool. That can make you feel like you are, fighting the system. But fundamentally, right, you have the same politics as Wells Fargo, as Chase Bank, as Raytheon. You were owned completely and totally. And if it weren't kind of driving our society off a cliff, I would probably laugh at it more, right? That the left wing has become so totally owned by capital, that they've allowed themselves to be completely and totally subverted, that they have been effectively the whole kind of like thrust of the Marxian left has basically been completely and totally subverted by big gay corporations. Now, obviously, there are very negative side effects to that, but the kind of gall of it, right, to basically say like, oh, I'm fighting the system, when you are in effect exactly what the system strives to create. I mean, I think it's another reason why so much of this rings hollow, is because they're adopting that kind of mode. They were adopting those kind of, I guess you would say, like symbols of cultural reaction, or cultural rebellion rather, but reaping all the rewards of being a soldier of the regime. And to your point about being a right-wing creative being dangerous, I mean that's very, very true, right? That there are certain symbols and sayings that if you incorporate either into your persona or your art, will remove you from all society entirely. I was talking to a buddy of mine who is, shall we say, a quite prominent member of a pagan group, right? Which, not my tribe, but a nice guy nonetheless, creative guy. And he was talking about the the Hell's Angels, right? Obviously these are dangerous criminals. They're human traffickers, meth dealers. They run guns, right? Scary guys. And they have a new policy, not a new policy. They have a policy now that Hell's Angels don't use symbols associated with mid-century Germans, right? That from their perspective, it was seen as being too dangerous or too disreputable, right, to associate with those symbols. And my point in that is not to, lionize either the Hells Angels or the mid-century Germans, but to say like that is seen as being more objectionable or more dangerous by the regime. That kind of tendency. And I think that you're entirely right. It's part of the reason why there seems to be so much pressure on keeping right-wing creatives out of the marketplace, so to speak, to adopt that framing, right? Is that they feel some danger in that. And I think part of the hysterical reaction you see to people like Sam Hyde, who I don't watch a lot of his current stuff. I was kind of around for MDE round one and fell off after that. I think part of it is that he says offensive things, but the other part of it is that is very clearly a charismatic, creative guy with far right politics. We have to make that go away right now. Right? We're going to try and ruin his life, and I think that archetype is something that they fear.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just it's also very frustrating because the left can't make good art even on accident anymore. Because up until like I'd say maybe the 2010s, the left were still comfortable enough to engage with right-wing ideas that you could get a decently right-wing movie that slips through the wall. But nowadays, like even movies that superficially you might think would touch on right-wing ideas and ideas of the current times, they're so carefully constructed that they can't say anything controversial whatsoever. I'm thinking of particularly Alex Garland's recent movie, Civil War movie, where it was a movie from the trailers that looks like it was going to touch upon the right-wing, left-wing divide of the of the country and how that might play out in a violent way. And from my standpoint, I was thinking, okay, how is he going to make this movie and not get canceled by the left? And the answer was he just used the entire movie as an excuse to praise journalists. And he used all the controversial aspects. I remember the meme, what kind of American are you, that took hold on Twitter when this movie was coming out, and the energy just completely dissipated because it was so carefully constructed. It cannot say anything of substance whatsoever of the current time and the current spiritual mode we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good example, right? That everything has to be, much like the German cat, right? Like filtered through current regime ideology. Nothing actually interesting can be said. And, obviously, as I said earlier, there's always a certain amount of that. You can't really escape from that. Man is a political animal. But at the same time, it's run rampant to the degree to where it's like, I was pirating a, sports event, right? The other night while I was working, just kind of watching it in the background. And, the pirating site was pulling from, UK advertisements, right? So it was slightly more interesting just in the sense that it's companies I don't normally see. It's not advertisements I'd ever see anywhere else. So it sort of catches your eye, right? And, even in these advertisements, right, as, it's kind of parodied by Stone Toss, right, with the burgers comic. It's like, well, yeah, of course there's a product being advertised for, car insurance or, whatever. But effectively it exists as a political reinforcement of the regime, right? And it's effectively like CalArt North Korea. It's basically like just a few steps away from kind of like Dear Leader stuff. And okay, sure, that's something that doesn't really matter. It's advertisements on a sports game, whatever, is what it is. But it's kind of symptomatic of the same thing. And look, like I'll be the first one to admit, I'm not a huge movie buff, but I used to go see movies quite often. And, really after COVID, I think I've seen, I can probably count it on one hand, the number of films I've seen, and even less that I thought were actually worth going to. And obviously, look, like part of that has to do with, slop culture, right? Things becoming global. But it's very clear, right, that the propaganda arm, as it existed through, legacy entertainment, is failing. And look, like there's certainly still just as much fake and gay stuff on the internet. That's not my point at all. But to say that, that deal depended on, the rat poison tasting good, right, of getting people to pay attention enough to kind of imbibe it. And, I think one of the problems, and we could, go back to our earlier conversation about competence or, who's being hired for any of these things, is at a certain point, it's so bad, nobody wants to watch it. And, I think it's interesting. The amount of, major media companies that have had to, make cuts, have to kind of revise what they're doing. This is not, necessarily a go woke, go broke thing, but at a certain point, much like, Beyond Meat, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And I think that, part of the reason that so many of these forms are failing is that they don't have people competent enough to either one, disregard or, remove the propaganda, or at least tone it down, or at the very least make it interesting enough to the mass public. Sorry, Isaac, that was a big rant from me. I'm curious if there's anything you want to go on from there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The go woke, go broke kind of chant on the right wing. I was there in 2018 when The Last Jedi basically caused the entire internet to descend into a shitstorm. And that was sort of the belief of pretty much every YouTuber who was negatively covering The Last Jedi and Star Wars and all these franchises going woke, is the idea was eventually, if enough people vote with their wallets, that these franchises will go back to being the beloved entertainment that they once were. And I think in 2025, that idea did not pan out. At least if it's going to pan out, it's going to pan out over the course of several decades and not any short-term timeline. Because, as you said, the competency crisis, but also even when they're trying to remove woke elements from, even if they try to remove all the woke elements from these shows, they still come across as pale imitations of what they kind of came before. The movies I'm thinking of right now is the Tom Cruise movies that are still, they're still decent, with maybe the exception of the recent Mission Impossible film, which I heard was quite atrocious. But even the old guard seem to have lost the magic. And I think it's because they don't really believe in anything real. And even when they can be conditioned to keep out the woke, which is the thing that they actually believe in, they don't have anything really substantive to say.
Yeah, and I mean that's a very important part of it. Having a moderate sized podcast, I quite often get emails, messages, whatever, from people who want to start their own, and I'm certainly flattered. I am not the person you should go to advice for that, for any number of reasons. But one of the things that comes up is, people ask me for advice. And the thing I say is always like, don't make anything unless you have something to say. Right. And that doesn't need to be a fully formed idea, or some, manifesto. But, and I'm sure you see this in your art form as well. The market is plagued with people who have nothing to say. And some of them have quite a big budget. Some of them have no budget. And it's incredibly soulless, right? It is something that exists merely to exist, right? Not driving towards anything. And, certainly this is something I've noticed in media as well, right? Like if you go to the top, or the charts, right? The most listened to podcasts on, whatever podcatcher you're listening to this, YouTube will do the same thing, right? You'll notice that there are dozens of these just random celebrity podcasts, right? Where it's like someone kind of famous. You're like, I think I know who that is, talking about basically nothing to basically nobody, right? It is purely, Ouroboros-esque podcasting. And my point in this is not to say, everything has to be super serious, not at all, but to say that because of this, kind of like it is incredibly easy to start, and there's some benefits to that. but it has enabled, this kind of explosion of completely and totally pointless media, with absolutely no end in mind. And, when we talk about kind of like mass media, we see the same thing, right? That so many of these exist simply to exist. There's nothing actually being said. And I think that to kind of, crib a line from a, a more famous kind of media critic, right? It's like, well, even if you didn't notice, your brain did, right? Where it feels hollow. Maybe you can't put your finger on it, but nonetheless, it feels like, an ersatz version of the real thing.
Yeah, and I've especially felt this actually with a lot of right-wing critique, or air quotes, right-wing critique nowadays. At least politically wise, the right wing has never been more interesting. But cultural wise, it's for me, and I've talked to a few other people, and they've been noticed that they've been disengaging sort of as well.
Oh, I feel exactly the same way. It's why I've largely gotten off Substack.
Yeah, because there's two main things. First is some person who's very famous on our sphere released a video which prompted me to come to this realization. It was the secret subversion of X movie director, right? And it's covering all his films and all the secret subversiveness. And I was looking at this and I was like, I would have loved this video back in 2018. I would have ate it up. I would have, put it on and listened to it for an hour or so. But nowadays in 2025, there's nothing really left the right wing can say on culture. And partly because the woke is slop, and you can only have so many takes on slop before it gets boring. But also the right wing commentary that the right has been producing on art, it doesn't seem to be really going anywhere. It exists in perpetual reaction to the left. I mean, even if I watch this video and I understood the secret subversion, which I already know, it's not leading to anywhere else but further commentary and critique. And that's all the right seems to be doing culturally, is just commentary and critique of the left-wing products. And yeah, I was talking to my friend and he mentioned it too. And that's why I feel like this is a broader thing and not just my own sensibilities. And the second thing is I'm on Substack and I built a decently sized audience. But the fire kind of died in me to try to write more right-wing commentary, because I felt like everything's just been said. And I would be better off creating fiction, because even though it's far less profitable for me to do so, it's something that's not going to spiritually kill me writing it.
Yeah, and that's another point to it, right? That critique is a useful thing, right? If you were trying to tear something down. And it is something that I mentioned, while talking to Benjamin Boyce the other day, right? Is that like we are facing something that needs to be torn down. But equally, there is a danger in that, right? It's not particularly good for you personally to just kind of be in an endless kind of like cycle of critique. But also, at a certain point, there's a time to build and a time to create things. And I don't mean that in just kind of this airy way of like, oh, go out there and do something, do a heckin' wholesome self-care or whatever, the kind of like Reddit troons say. But point is, right, that like that analysis is like a useful thing and it's a tactic. It is not an end in and of itself. And similarly, right, we can look at social media like YouTube or Twitter. The point is not to win there. The point is not necessarily to say like I have achieved my goal of n+1 subscribers or likes or whatever. Right, it's to actually accomplish some sort of like meaningful change, in meat space, as the the older guys would say.
Yeah, it's just I can't imagine a more depressing future for the right wing culturally if in the next 10 years we're still talking about Star Wars, we're still talking about Star Trek, we're still talking about all these Hollywood franchises that are not just on life support, they're essentially corpses being paraded around. If all we're talking about in 2035 is beyond like cultural wise, just these dead entertainment platforms, that nothing could be more depressing to me. And I hope by the time the next decade rolls around that we have something actually exciting and new and fresh to talk about. Yeah, that's
Well, sure thing, man. Obviously, we're kind of coming up on time, and I guess we didn't even scratch the surface of your project. I guess that was what we were supposed to talk about, but as per usual, I did not follow my own advice. So, one, if people want to find your work, where can they find it? And two, do you want to describe what your latest project has been in a little bit more detail?
Sure. So, I mean, you can find The Last Human on my YouTube channel. I suppose you can attach links. You can find it on my Patreon. That's where you can view all the advanced episodes. I'm currently actually wrapping up season 1. The penultimate episode was released yesterday, and so the season finale will be this Sunday. After which there'll be a couple weeks of downtime before I start cranking out season 2, which I'm hoping I can get to before the end of July. So in terms of talking about what The Last Human is more broadly from the anti-Star Trek, is science fiction has always been sort of the genre of the progressive. It's always been the genre of, the atheist and the left, essentially. And what I wanted to do with The Last Human was to take a look at a bunch of progressive tropes and try to turn them on their head. And I guess the easiest way I can put it is the left-wing vision for the future is essentially the Star Trek future, where it's this completely deracinated, atomized culture that is constantly taking in the other, and it's always about egalitarianism to the extreme. And I wanted to try to strike at a sci-fi future where that world is sort of collapsed, and all there's left is people trying to forge an identity that isn't deconstructed. That's just one theme of the series, and there's a whole lot more.
Well, sure thing. As you said, I'll make sure to link that down in the description. Appreciate you coming out to record with me, Isaac. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. As I've teased before, there will be a big change coming to the show sometime soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Should be more content. So for all of you, Burden heads out there, good news. If you want to support us, which I do appreciate, you can either do that directly with crypto down in the link in the descriptions. I know the market's up, so if you are one of these Bitcoin billionaires, I'd sure appreciate some of it. Or you can check out Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. And again, Isaac, appreciate it. To everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.